Peter Gray, who, for those of you who were here on day one, Dr. Gray was able to sort of inspire us to start thinking a little bit more deeply about the declining rates of play. However, this morning he's actually going to help bring those thoughts all together. So, Dr. Gray, thank you. Please come up. Go on, you can do it.
I wish I had been scheduled to go first this morning. I hate to change the energy. This is such a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for this. I'm perhaps not going to entirely change the topic because my interest also is in change and how do we make change for the better in a way that empowers young people who are not currently empowered. So at Wednesday's plenary session 2 days ago, I gave a talk on the decline of play in North America and much of Western Europe, throughout the world in a way that has been occurring over the last 50 or 60 years, a dramatic decline in play. And I talked about how over that same period of time there had been equally dramatic increases in all sorts of mental disorders in youth. And this is just regardless of social class, regardless of race. People, the rates of depression, the rates of anxiety, the rates of suicide have increased dramatically, and it's not just our perception that they've increased. There's real data showing those increases, which I summarized last time. You've got on your tables and someplace on the website a handout for that talk that summarizes that, and on the back of that handout is lists of documented evidence supporting those claims. So today what I want to do is talk about what do we do about this. How can we restore play in today's world? So what I've created here is a list of things that I think that those of us who understand play, understand the value of play, recognize that children are suffering from lack of play, can do to bring play back to children's lives. So the first thing we can do, and in a sense it's a necessary precondition for everything else, is to do what we can to educate the general public about the value of play. You know, certainly in the United States, and I suspect it's true elsewhere too, we're constantly hearing propaganda about the value of school and more school, about the value of adult-directed sports, about the value of all kinds of activities that adults help children at. And we hear almost no propaganda about the value of children's own activities. Part of the result of all of that propaganda is that childhood has been turned into a time of resume building, especially for middle class and upper class families. It's been turned away from a period of freedom, a period of children discovering themselves, discovering the world around them, into a period of doing things that will go on a resume. The kinds of things that I just listed, that we hear all this propaganda about, this can go on a resume. Parents see it, oh, maybe this will help my child get into college or get a scholarship in college and so on. Play doesn't go on a resume. There's no place for it. There's no place for it on the college application, so therefore play must just be a waste of time. So how do we combat that? And my argument is we have to, with all the force that others have given for the value of all these adult-directed activities, we have to talk to people, present to people in every way that we can the value of children's own self-directed activities, that they really need this, that it's a pathological environment without that. Let me tell a very brief little story. I mean, I've been trying to do this in many, many ways, with my book, with my blog on Psychology Today, with talks I've given, a TEDx talk I've given, and so on and so forth. And I'm often invited to speak on radio and television about play. And let me tell you one of my first experiences on radio. I was invited to be on one of these little, it was billed as a debate, a 3-minute debate, right, on a news program. And it was about whether school should be extended through the summer. This is a serious debate in Massachusetts. There are people seriously proposing schools should go through the summer. And I, of course, was on the negative on this question. I was arguing that we should preserve summer. And so when the host of the talk, of the debate, asked me to say something, he said, well, Professor Gray, why do you think that we should keep summer vacation? I said, because children play in the summer, and play makes children happy. Turned out that was a stupid thing for me to say, because what the host then said was, well, the host, this was supposedly the moderator of the debate, not my opponent. He said, well, happiness isn't everything, you know. Well, okay, and that was the last... That was the last thing I got to say, truly. That was the last thing I got to say. So I went home kind of with my tail between my legs, and I thought, okay, next time, what will I say? So actually, I then did have another time. And the next time, when I was in this situation, debate on the very same topic, I said, well, because in the summer, children play a lot, and play is how children learn a lot of things. Now, this is interesting. Happiness wasn't interesting, but learning, now we've got something, right? So now I could talk. It demands a follow-up. Oh, they learn? What do they learn? So then I can talk. Now I can talk about all the things that children learn in play. And oh, by the way, I can sneak in, it also makes them happy, you know. So people are, it's in our culture. Everybody's interested in learning. There's not a whole lot of interest in happiness. So we kind of have to sneak in the happiness part. We have to talk about learning, and it is true that children learn an enormous amount in play. And these are things that they cannot learn in school. They cannot learn in adult-directed activities, as I described last time. So there's another thing that we have to do in terms of educating the general public, not just about the value of play, but also about a different approach to risk assessment. So another kind of propaganda that we hear all the time is propaganda about how dangerous it is out there. This really began in full force in the United States around 1980, late 1970s into the 1980s. Suddenly we began to hear public service announcements on the radio that said, do you know where your children are? As if you are a negligent parent if you don't know where your children are right now. It became to be a moral imperative that you have to know where your children are at every minute, or you are a negligent parent. And that moral view began to spread. I mean, when I was a kid, by that view, all parents were negligent. Nobody knew where their kids were most of the time. So, and that was a good thing. Kids were out there playing, exploring, solving their own problems, and so forth. But now we have this moral view that it is wrong to let your children. And the moral view is supported by very misleading data. So the other thing that began to happen around that period of time was the spread of the idea that strangers are dangerous, stranger danger. You began also at that time, there was on milk cartons photos of missing kids. People would, at breakfast, the milk carton would show some every day you were faced, here's a kid, this sweet young girl has, and you could only imagine what terrible thing must have happened to her. It turns out that most of those cases were runaways. Almost none of them were cases of anybody actually having been snatched away, the kind of fear that people have. And when you look at the actual data, the snatching of a child away, is terribly rare, terribly rare. I mean, somebody calculated you would have to leave your child on the very most dangerous neighborhood in New York City for several thousand years before somebody would snatch that child away. You know, of course it can happen, and it does happen, and when it happens, we all hear about it, and so we think it's much more common than it is. So we have to educate the public about this statistic. Yeah, you can get hit by lightning too. You know, these things can happen. You can't guarantee that it can't happen, but the chance is very small. My friend Lenore Skenazy, who wrote the book Free Range Kids and who partners with me in some of this work now, talks about this as worst first thinking. We've sort of been trained when our child asks us, can I go to the park or something, or can I do this or that, to immediately think of the very worst thing that could possibly happen if we said yes to that. And then as soon as we got that picture in our mind of the very worst thing that could possibly happen, we kind of assume, well, that's what would happen. And we forget that this is just one, this is a very unlikely possibility. It's a terrible possibility. Yes, it would be terrible if this happened. But we need to educate people about the actual statistical likelihood of something, of these awful images that we have happening. And the other thing we need to do is to recognize that if you're going to make a risk assessment, you have to think of both sides of it. So there's a risk in letting your child go to the park without an adult, but what's the risk of not letting your child go to the park without an adult? Everything we do entails risk, and everything we choose not to do entails risk. So what is that? So if your child goes to the park, there's a tiny, tiny chance that something terrible could happen to your child. If your child is regularly denied the opportunity for such adventures, my argument is there's a statistically pretty high probability that something bad will happen to your child, and that's that your child will not develop the kind of confidence, the kind of courage, the kind of street smarts, the kind of grit, if you will, that it takes to really face the bumps in the road of life. The suicide rate is going up. Maybe your child will commit suicide at some point. I don't usually say that to parents, but I like to imply that. So that if you're going to think about terrible things, think about the possible terrible things that could happen if you don't let your child go to the park. So we've got to reframe the way the conversation is and the way people think about these things. So another thing that I should say something about Lenore. Lenore has this wonderful little program that she works with parents, and she sometimes works through the school system. And here's what she does to try to sort of desensitize parents about their fears. When she works with a family, she'll say, or with a let's say a mom, she'll say to the mom, I'd like you to do this. I'd like you to ask your daughter to list the things that she would really like to do that she is currently not allowed to do. Let her just make a list of those things. So the daughter makes a list. The list is presented to the mom. And then the question is there anything on this list that you feel you could allow your daughter to do? So now maybe the daughter says, I'd like to go to the park all by myself, or I'd like to walk to school alone or with my friend and no adult. I'd like to do that. And so the mother looks at this and experiences her fears, and she says, oh, all right, okay, I'll agree to going to the park, but only for 15 minutes. You know, go 15 minutes. If you're not back in 15 minutes, I'm gonna go and find you there. So the mother does the most that she feels she can do without her getting panicky about it, right? So the child goes to the park. The mother's very nervous. The child comes back. And the child is beaming. She did this. I did this. I went to the park all by myself. I didn't have much time to play, but I went to the park, came back. I survived. I lived to tell the story, right? And she's beaming, and here's what Lenore tells me. In a minute, the mother is beaming too. The mother is so proud that her daughter did this. Now she's maybe ready to let the daughter take another step, go play a little longer in the park. It's a kind of desensitization of the fears. And we're working sort of on promoting this through schools, where it will be an assignment to students to generate such a list, give it to their parents, see if their parents, and if it's a school assignment, the parents have to do it, right? I mean, then come back and give a little report on what your parent now allowed you to do. So it's a way of sort of generating, reframing this kind of what it means to be a good parent. I allowed my child to do this. Okay, so another problem besides these beliefs we have that children's play is a waste of time and that it's so dangerous out there. Another problem is even those parents, and I hear from so many of them, who let their child go out and want their child to go out, they're almost pushing their child out, and who believe in all of this stuff and recognize that the risk is low. The children go out and there's nobody to play with. So they come back in or they sit down and go onto their iPhone or iPad or whatever it is because there's nobody to play with. So what do you do about that? So how do we solve that problem? And that's a question I'm asked almost every time I speak to parents and have given it some thought. So one thing there's certain kind of things, somewhat simple things you can come up with. So for example, one thing that I'll suggest to groups of parents is if you go on a vacation, and many families go on a vacation for a week or 2 weeks at some point, instead of thinking of it just as family time, why not combine with some other families you know who have kids and go on a vacation together, maybe off to a provincial park or state park, and then the kids can play with one another and do kid things, and the adults can do adult things. And instead of always thinking of family time, and kids don't need, at least in the cultures that I'm looking at, don't need more time with parents. They need more time with other kids away from parents. And so so think of your vacation that way. And I've known families who've done that, and they've reported it to be a wonderful experience, their best vacation, and the kids especially thought it was their best vacation because they got to play with other kids, and because the adults had other adults to talk to, the adults weren't so much in the faces of the kids. So that's one simple thing to do. But what about something that's sort of more lasting? How do we restore neighborhood play? As I said, back in the 1950s, you could go outdoors and there were always kids outdoors playing. It wasn't a problem. There were just always kids outdoors playing. Now there's fewer kids and they're not outdoors, and so how do we restore that? One person who's tackled that problem is Mike Lanza, L-A-N-Z-A. I mentioned his book on that handout. And hey, there's some Lanza fans here. So he wrote a book called Playborhood, and I've gotten to know him. I visited his home. So he had, at the time that he started getting interested in this, he had one young son. He's now got 3 young sons. And he moved into this sort of wealthy neighborhood in Menlo Park, California, and he could see that there were kids in the neighborhood because he could see them out waiting for the school bus in the morning, but he never saw them at any other time. And so he thought, oh, what am I going to do? I want my kids to have friends. I want them to be able to play in the neighborhood. So he took the approach of turning his front yard into basically a neighborhood playground. Instead of putting the kind of playground equipment that most people would put in their backyard, he put it in their front yard. And he also put a nice little sandbox there and some water, a fountain. He made the driveway into a nice little basketball area. He had a toy box out there. And they also put the family picnic table out in front instead of back. So nobody in that neighborhood particularly knew anybody, but pretty soon they all got to know the Lanzas because the Lanzas were always out there. And they couldn't help, if they ever were walking down the street, they'd stop and chat. And the Lanzas would say, oh, by the way, your kids are welcome to play here anytime, whether we're here or not. And basically, they put a please trespass sign up on their front lawn. And pretty soon, kids were playing there. And I visited Mike Lanza last summer, and his oldest kid is now about 9 or 10 years old and has friends, and they go off to the skate park. They skateboard to school or bicycle to school, and they're doing a lot of the stuff that people used to do. I wouldn't say that he's successfully turned the whole neighborhood into anything like an old-fashioned play, but he's gone in some direction in that way. In his book, he describes for other very different communities how they solve the problem. So, for example, one low-income housing projects where there really are dangers for sending kids out. There's bad traffic, there's drug pushers. They solve the problem by parents getting together, parents realizing their kids need to get out to play, and they got the city to close off the street for certain hours after school, close off the street to traffic in front of the housing project so that the kids could play in the street. And they had a bunch of grandmothers sitting out there to drive the drug pushers away. So that was their, that was their way of solving the problem. And so he goes through different chapters with different communities taking the approach. But it takes some initiative. Somebody's got to say, hey, this is a problem. And they've got to find other people there who recognize this as a problem. And then let's put our heads together and figure out how we can solve this problem, or at least remedy it to some degree. So another thing that Lenore Skenazy and I are trying to promote is programs of play at school. Schools could be great places for play. You know, they've got typically outdoor playground, they've got a gymnasium, some of them even have swimming pools, they've got art supplies, computers, all the kinds of stuff you would want to play almost anything with. And that stuff is largely going to waste during non-school hours. And also there's this period of time between 3 o'clock in the afternoon when school ends and 5 or 6 o'clock when parents come home, where parents have a babysitting problem. So what if we had an after-school program that is not like most after-school programs, which is clubs and adult-led things or help with homework. We had an after-school program of free play, free age-mixed play. Making use of all the school resources. It would be relatively inexpensive to do. It would solve, parents, I would think, would love it because it solves the babysitting problem. And this could provide, 3 hours times 5 days, 15 hours a week of free play. That would go a long ways towards bringing play back into children's lives. And it's something, we're not going to go back to the 1950s, but it's something that in modern day could almost bring us to that kind of level of play. And the kids, it could be an age-mixed play, kids from different grades are all playing together. And because it's at the school, of course, there have to be monitors. There's laws about all of this. But we could train the monitors essentially to be play workers, where they're not intervening. Well, it turns out I've been talking about this, and there's a school system in New York that has taken us up on it. And we're just starting it this year. This is a superintendent of schools who's actually done a TEDx talk on how he hated school, and now here he is as a superintendent of schools. And what is he going to do to make the school life better? And he sort of gravitated, read my book, and he'd read Lenore's book, and he contacted us, and he's interested in us working with him to bring play to the school. He couldn't convince the school principals in his district to go right directly into the 3 hours of after-school play, but they already have a before-school program for kids whose parents have to leave them off, and it's not a very interesting before-school time. They're basically hanging out there for an hour or so, and they're not allowed to do a lot, or they have some structured activities. So he's interested, let's turn at least that hour before school for those 300 or so kids who are in that situation into a free play thing. So we're starting this, and we're actually starting it as an experiment. And then one of my immediate concerns was, all right, how are we going to train these basically teachers, most of whom are teachers, who are going to have to be the play monitors? I guess the law requires that there be one adult there for every 10 kids, which in my mind is ridiculous, but so it has to be. How are we going to train these people not to intervene, not to be play directors? And so our idea is we're going to turn them into researchers. We're going to tell them, your job, this is a study, this is a scientific study, and you are field researchers, and your job is to observe and record what's happening without intervening. It's just like you're a naturalist. You're out there watching wild animals in the woods, and your job is not to tell the wild animals what to do. Your job is to record their behavior for the sake of science. And so, of course, if somebody's killing somebody else, and then you may have to intervene. I'm hoping that this is going to work, to change the mindset. And wouldn't it be interesting if that change in mindset, where they're watching the children to try to understand the children and record data, record information that might go into a scientific paper about how children resolve their own problems when nobody else is solving it for them, might that even change their attitude in how they interact with children in the classroom? Maybe they would see children as having more capacities and abilities. Maybe they'd be more interested in children's ideas and not just interested in telling children what to think, but maybe they'd now be interested in hearing what children think. So this is something that I'm very excited about, that we're just getting started on. Now, there's only about 5 minutes left, so let me say something briefly about an even larger project that Lenore and I are involved. By the way, we've just sort of started, and it's only becoming legally formed now, a nonprofit group called Let Grow, and our slogan is Let Go and Let Grow. And so the idea is that we want to promote the idea that in order for children to really grow in healthy ways, we have to let go of them more than we currently are. We have to give them, we have to trust them more, we have to stop overprotecting them. So what we are trying to do, and we already have 2 or 3 communities interested in this, is find communities that want to take this on for the whole community. We'll be calling them capable kids communities. We declare our city to be a capable kids community. And what that means is we want to empower children. We want to make it once again possible for children to occupy public spaces, even without an adult there. We want to make it possible for children to walk to school with one another in the joyful ways that children walk to school instead of having to be driven or taking a school bus. We want to make these things possible, and in order to do that, we are bringing all the powers that be in the city to bear on this. So we're bringing not only the schools, we're bringing the Parks and Recreation Department. So let's say the Parks and Recreation Department, they've already got some kind of a youth sports program. So they've got youth soccer and baseball and so on and so forth. So we're not going to tell them to take that away. That's fine. But let's add one more thing to the program. Let's add what we might call the Sandlot experience. So in the Sandlot experience, this will be something where if parents think they have to take their kids there because the kid can't get there themselves, that's okay. But the parents are not allowed to stay. They have to leave the kid off, and now there's the opportunity for all kinds of games. There's the equipment for it, there's other kids to play it, but nobody's going to organize it for them. They have to organize it themselves. That's the Sandlot experience. And so that would be a regularly scheduled thing, just like these other things. And our hope is that once kids are doing that, they would say, oh, this is so much fun. Once they really get into it, they say to their moms and other people, hey, we want to get together also, not just on Saturday afternoon, we want to get together on Sunday afternoon or after school. And so maybe we can bring back the old-fashioned kind of child-directed and teen-directed play that used to be the main way that kids played sports and where they learned so much more than they do when adults are directing the activity. We would bring the police and the protective services into the discussion on this, so that right now, parents who allow their kid to go to the park alone, there is some chance that somebody's going to call the police, because this is regarded as negligent parenting by many people in the United States. And there are quite a number of cases, I'm becoming more and more aware of cases, where the police have been called because, believe it or not, there's a 10-year-old kid walking down the street without an adult. So this would be, Lenore and I would be meeting with all of these people, and the hope would be that there'd be a real discussion in the community, and the police would come to understand that this is not a crime. And so they would have a way of responding. They might say, so somebody calls and says, I spotted a 10-year-old on Main Street and 45th Street, no adult around. And the police would be trained to say, Well, was there any crime in action? Was there any life being threatened? Thank you for your call, and if you do see a crime, please give us a call. You know, if we could respond that way, instead of right now, they respond as if somebody calls, it must be an emergency, we've got to do something about it, we've got to get protective services involved, and so on. So protective services would also be brought into this. We bring pediatricians into this, so that pediatricians, I think parents get a lot of information about how to raise kids from pediatricians. If every pediatrician had a little flyer to give to parents about the value of free play, and we give them a little talk about the value of free play, wouldn't that go a long way? So the idea is, and we've got already 2 or 3 communities who are at least interested in doing this, and at least some of these powers that be are on board. And as soon as we get enough of these powers that be on board, I think our hope is that we will see the spread of communities proudly calling themselves capable kids communities, and then other kids will want to do it. Well, I've gone beyond my time, and thank you very much for your attention.